Watch The Toxic Avenger now on Screambox. The radioactive superhero that's certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes is available to watch now from the comfort of your home. Bloody FM listeners get a special introductory offer by going to bit.ly/ToxyFM. That's bit.ly/ToxieFM for a special offer on Screambox.
Sometimes you gotta do something.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, your weekly source for horror gaming discussions and proudly part of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
Well, Neil, this week, I'm glad to have you back in the mix after you missed last week because of my screwing up the schedule, but we have quite the game to talk about this week for your return, no?
Yeah, and in a way that's nice that we come back and we get to talk about this, so it's like, can't complain.
Yeah, I mean, for you to come back after a week away and getting to chat about arguably one of the biggest games of the year, not only for us personally speaking, but also just, horror games in general is more than fitting for the show, I think. So, but, before we get into that, just a friendly reminder to everyone that if you haven't done so already, please give last week's episode of Horror Bites, our bi-weekly indie horror gaming showcase, a listen. As we rounded out our theme of 9 to 5 horror with two drastically different but no less creative genres uses of workplace settings and whatnot. But now that bit of housekeeping is out of the way, let's get into this week's game that we're going to be covering. And really, there's no grab bag this week because what else are we going to talk about as we haven't done so yet? That being the 9th main series entry in the Resident Evil series, Resident Evil Requiem, which picks up 28 years after the destruction of Raccoon City, in which players are introduced to FBI analyst newcomer Grace Ashcroft, whose investigation into the mysterious deaths of Raccoon City survivors has her crossing paths with everyone's favorite RCPD rookie turned BSO agent Leon Kennedy, as they are once again, fighting the good undead fight, if you will. But we did sort of like a preview chat about this game a few weeks ago, and just, there was that basically overview video that kind of like was detailing more about what boils down to essentially like the two halves of Requiem, which is very reflective, of Resi's more modern identity, right? The fact that the game is split between both Grace Ashcroft, who is the more survival horror focused portion of the experience. She's not a grizzled veteran to the degree that, or at all, that Leon is. And her half of the experience is in first person, and it's more akin to like the opening hour of, let's say, Resident Evil 7, where you're not this super powered badass. She very much, relies on stealth, given that it is a much weaker character than, Leon, where the other half of Requiem's experience is playing as Leon, which is not in first person, it's in third person, and it's more akin to the action-oriented nature of Resident Evil from RE4 and then 5 and 6 and whatnot. So that was the thing that we were like probably the most excited about, I would say, right? This notion of like, well, if you're going to split this experience between two drastically different gameplay styles, how does that sort of shape up in a full-fledged game that, is 9 to 12 hours roughly, let's say. But I figured, we should probably lead with Grace's portion first, and then we'll chat about Leon, and we can chat about all the ins and outs of this game. How does that sound to you, Neil?
Yeah, we'll try anyway, at least. I'm sure, much like the game itself, we will veer in and out of both stories and swim from Leon to Grace in certain ways.
Yeah. I guess that leads us to the opening of the game, which is not the main setting. It's kind of like, if you will, the tutorial portion of Requiem, where you find yourself investigating the Wrenwood Hotel, which is this decommissioned hotel. And that's where the latest corpse has turned up that Grace has to investigate. And for me, like, this had the most sort of like Condemned-esque feel to the entire game. And it was much more in line with sort of, Resi 7, if you will. The fact that you're exploring this like dilapidated environment and you don't have a whole lot of context for what's going on, and you're kind of just soaking in this very oppressive and dark and creepy atmosphere.
Yeah, it's it's all about that sort of setup ambience that was definitely more present in 7 because 8 obviously was a bit shorter in that, I guess, in terms of you had a little bit of cold comfort before getting into the action of it. But yeah, it was a nice showcase visually for a start that you have this like really well detailed little portion of a city. It was nice. I mean, from there, it felt very obvious. Well, we know generally from everything that's been seen beforehand that this isn't going to be the game because this is, yeah, we didn't know we'd return here for anything, but given what we did know that we were going to that care center and back to Raccoon City for definite, that to be a long game at this, or we probably wouldn't spend too much time here.
Yeah.
So yeah, it ends up being a nice sort of pace setter in an opening without kind of ruining anything of the environment. And I think that's a difference, I suppose, when you go back to earlier Resi games in the recent ones, is they had that sort of like connection, I suppose, but playing for the openings didn't feel particularly interesting again the second time round. Like, and while there isn't like loads to do, and you obviously don't have quite the same tension the second time round, I think it's just the atmosphere that's built up and just the detail that you get to appreciate the second time. Because as I said, the first time you're a bit more on edge, like what's going to happen, what's going to go through this. But yeah, honest to God, the second time through, it was just seeing all these little details. And while most of it is just for show, and that it really is like a brilliant showcase of how far we've come in like the last 7, 8 years, 9 years now. So let's me go 7 years and go, no, it's been longer. But yeah, it's a really strong visual opening in that regard. Plays around with the usual tricks. There's a few bits to it where you kind of go, okay, we've seen these tricks in the last couple of mainline games. In terms of like, here's a sound, there's a thing. It's like, but it's not going to really kick in until some prompted action happens. And but again, that's fine. There are a few bits in this game, I think we could say that, where it's like, does this really work on a replay when you've lost some of the tension and uncertainty? Like, okay, maybe not for that, but for the story, and yeah, understandable. But as openings go, strong. I'd say it's pretty strong. Like in a series that's full of strong starts, it's not like the best, but I think it's once again, I think better than what we had with Village, which was okay, shocking, but I think by that point, it's like, I don't know. I think it's the change in character is a big thing. I think because even when the character he was and turned out to be in all the things that weren't really explained very well, you kind of got led down this path of, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel real, like that. And and he wasn't really like massive on personality. And very early on with Grace, it's like you see that she's while she's an FBI agent, she is naturally scared by the madness that's happening so she should be, because most normal people would be. So yeah, it's like it is an interesting balance from a character point, where it's someone who is qualified enough to be out in the field, but is only really in the FBI to sort of find answers to her own past in a way, really, rather than go out there guns blazing, taking down criminals.
Yeah, for me, the opening to this game kind of rectified one of the issues that I had with Village, especially when I went back to replay it, in that I think that Requiem does not waste its first major setting. It really does use the Renwood Hotel just as like a primer, right? It's there to catch us up on the narrative bits. It's there to, teach the fundamentals of Grace's experience. And yet it doesn't feel like time is wasted in the true first opening environment, which is going to be, the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, which we're going to get into. But that was my issue, though, with Village, was that, Castle Dimitrescu was like such a cool setting. And yet I found that it was over too quickly, right? And along with kind
Yeah.
of the handling of that antagonist, somebody that was poised in the marketing to like be this major figure and then ends up not being, that doesn't end up being the case. So here, I liked the fact that they utilized this setting that of the hotel, which was like creepy. It was atmospheric. It does what it needs to do. And then you move on. And once that sort of like primer is out of the way, then you have this full-fledged setting of the care center, which is going to be, the brunt of the beginning portion of, her Grace's experience and whatnot, and exploring everything. And, I think that a hotel, again, like it's a fine enough setting because of the fact that you do have to address, the family lineage aspect of Requiem, which that being, Grace Ashcroft is the daughter of Resi Outbreak protagonist Alyssa Ashcroft. And so, they spend that time detailing that. And then that all leads into this notion of like the Raccoon City syndrome, if you will, where, survivors have this like late onset T virus basically symptoms. And, that's including Mr. Leon Kennedy and Sherry, who is his sort of like his operative that's in his ear, if you will, that he's constantly talking with. And so like, I think that again, it's a fine primer for setting everything up. And it even sets up, that central antagonist, or seems to be the central antagonist, that being of Victor Gideon, who, has a heavy handing of, Silence of the Lambs in him, if you will, in terms of just like this guy that is clearly like very in the throes of a T virus mutation, but like still has the wherewithal of who he is, but wears this, variety of basically like night vision goggles. What did you think about like this guy being poised as the central antagonist, and overall like him comparing to maybe some other antagonists that we've had in Resi before?
Well, yeah, I think initially it was like, okay. I was like, you're not really sure what to make of him. It's like, okay, so it's another nut job, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's the sheer size of him you don't really get, because he's often in cut scenes. Like you don't really get to sort of gauge the actual size of the man. And it's only like when you get certain scenes, like where he's like choking them out or something like that, where you're like, and with ease, you're like, okay, yeah, he's supposed to be intimidating and big. It's like, but of course he's so soft spoken and he's not really like that aggressive, considering like he's a character that definitely gets more interesting the more you learn about what he's doing. But yeah, I mean, we'll get into his like overall story at the end. But yeah, I was interested by what he was doing and the whole mad scientist sort of vibe of the thing of what was going on, and still being in the background. It was, yeah, it made sense. And you were bang on, obviously, with the Silence of the Lambs thing, where it is just like it's Buffalo Bill, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's like that with the night vision, just the hair and the. I mean, I don't really. I assume it was the whole light exposure thing. It's to say that has been a weakness with others where he's got the same problem, but yeah, there's a lot of like seeing through his night vision goggles and analyzing people. But yeah, it's you don't really get a sort of grip on what he's after. Like, this is a really good story, Resident Evil wise, for sort of subverting the idea of what you'd expect, like of people. Like, oh yeah, it's like he doesn't really give a shit about Leon. Like Leon's just like an accessory to the fact that he's there, whoopee sort of thing. But that he shows a lot of disinterest, really, apart from like a brief bit of admiration because he's gone through all this stuff and done all this stuff. But yeah, it's like he just, and the fact that when he does get to fight him properly in those moments, it's like Leon doesn't really get the better of it. Like, and yeah, I did wonder what the connection would be with anything, but of course, in establishing early on that he doesn't really have any connection with Leon, and it's more about Grace, and it's nice. We get nice fresh mystery. We don't get like a rehash, so to speak, of like considering the nostalgia bit that is in this game. The Leon stuff is not quite as bad as I thought it would be. Like in terms, I thought we'd have, certainly in terms of the certain characters that might come back and things that might happen. Yeah, like it was nice to have something that was more focused on Resident Evil history rather than just Leon's history. And Victor Gideon's whole thing of being like part of the original sort of Spencer research team and like being another sort of survivor from that era who just didn't quit. And just when Umbrella go belly up, he's like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna go and start my new like mad crazy thing, and almost having that religious zeal to him.
Yeah.
Whereas like when you think of obviously in Village, where obviously it was quite a religious thing to the context of the villain in that one, as it was revealed at the end. It's like, yeah, having it the more scientific side of it, it's nice to sort of go back to that and sort of seeing that through line, the history of like all the viruses and all the different things that have happened over the years to end up at these ultimate versions of those viruses. And yeah, like having that sort of Messiah complex is a given for most Resident Evil villains at this point. So yeah, he was a good villain. As we do find out, he's just part of the plan, if you.
Yeah, I'll obviously have a lot more to say on him probably towards the second half of our conversation. Overall, just like the narrative of Requiem and whatnot, what worked, what didn't necessarily work for us. But like right off the bat, he was a super sort of strong indication that maybe Requiem was heading in a direction that I was more interested in, because of the fact that, I've said this plenty of times when we've chatted about Resident Evil, like I'm not a huge fan of the narrative of these games for the most part. Like, people can enjoy them if they want to enjoy them, and they do enjoy them. But for me, like the whole like company conglomerate thing, supervillain aspect of it has never really always been like my favorite aspect of these games. So to have someone that is not like intrinsically tied to Leon's past, other than, his affiliation with Umbrella, was a strong indication that, again, we were going to get this new antagonist that is not monologuing to Leon about, his own history, if you will, right? It's more about this mad scientist, which, has always been a trope of the series, but he has this more sort of, as I already referenced, like Silence of the Lambs kind of aspect. He's a little bit more reserved, and it's more about him observing test subjects almost, which would be Grace and Leon, rather than this mastermind in terms of like an end of the world plot or plan, if you will. And so, yeah, he was like right off the bat, it was nice to have an antagonist that did not have the theatricality of, let's say, Albert Wesker, if you will, or some of the more outlandish characters from Resident Evil 4 or something along those lines. It's why Resident Evil 7 is still one of my favorite entries, because for a majority of that game, it's Baker family, right? Yeah, the Baker family like are these people that, became these monsters, but they're tragic figures in and of themselves. Was you learn their history, right? And it's like, they end up being pretty horrific on screen. Doesn't take long for that. But at the end of the day, like they felt more, I don't know, they felt more human, if you will, because of the ways in which they were introduced. And at the end of the day, like the Baker family are just people that are victims, and they don't have this grandiose plan. And so that was an aspect of those characters and their introduction that I always loved. And, the introduction of Victor is one of those things that I really, really enjoyed early on. And, and like I said, we'll talk about how he involves, but let's get into, Grace's experience, and the brunt of that being the care facility, because she naturally gets kidnapped by Victor. As all Resi protagonists at some point get kidnapped by the central antagonist, it seems. And she wakes up in this facility that, initially you're not dealing with a bunch of zombies, but there is this progressive and, rather persistent stalker enemy that kind of feels a lot like Lisa Trevor on steroids, this hulking, 12-foot monstrosity that stalks the halls and is always pursuing you if you make noise. And the only real deterrent, naturally, as it's a stalker enemy that can't be killed by traditional means, is that you have to utilize light to prevent them from either following you into an area, or at the end of the day, just kind of being able to give yourself a moment of reprieve. So I guess before we get too into the enemies and whatnot, what did you think about the care center as a setting?
Well, I suppose, are we taking it as a whole, like the stuff that's under it, around it, sort of thing.
Let's start with the top, the ground floor, if you will, and then we'll get into like the underground portion of it, because I think that's a pretty like pivotal, I suppose, segment of the experience.
Yeah, and I think it does sort of tie into it in a way that's good in terms of Resident Evil style history. But
Mm.
yeah, I mean, it's again one of the many times in this game where you just go, there's something familiar about this in the setup. I mean, the sort of hub area, if you will, like is akin to both, well, to pretty much the last two games, like
Mm.
with a bit of like Resident Evil 2 and even Spencer Mansion, and where you have these grandiose hallway and you have all these rooms off to each side and different things to each section. It's like but it's far more apparent here than I think we had maybe even in 7, especially in 8, which was obviously, you know, Dimitrescu Castle was like a small version of that, and as we said, very much done and dusted very quickly. Yeah, it's like it reminds you so much of the best things of a Resident Evil sort of structure, in terms of like exploring, going around, finding things, figuring out what you need to do with the different parts, opening up, shortcuts essentially to go from A to B. And yeah, and just finding new little surprises and in a confined space, something that makes it feel so much bigger than it actually is. It's like it's not a huge building, but like there's enough of it. Like the setup of it, like you don't get to see much of outside, but obviously there's like a model in the place as well where you can sort of see the overall layout and stuff, and that's great. But yeah, it's like it felt like a place again, in a way that more so than Resident Evil 2 did. Obviously because a video game, but of an earlier era. I really did like how it reined in, the eccentricities of like the Spencer Mansion or stuff in Raccoon City, and made it feel more like, well, it started as this, and then people just kind of built stuff around and under it, like as time went on, and it feels a bit more ad hoc in that regard. So it feels more like the cover, if you will, the top place is there and normal, and everything underneath does just feel like an afterthought that just happened to be burrowed underneath. Yeah, it's a fascinating layout. I think is the main thing. Like, I think by modern standards, it feels quite simple and tight, and like, oh, you've seen all these rooms, but yeah, it's really quite expansive when you think about it for the kind of things you have to do, and considering really time wise in the game, if it was just that in the game and we didn't have the second half, it wouldn't be terrible. I think it would be a really cool game. I think there would be a lot to have there. I think you pointed this out before, like it would not feel any different if you could have each part of that game could be its own part, like and be its own game and be fine and be great. You could have had a great time, and it's probably a testament to the fact that you have this combination that works so well. But I think you need to start like this, and have this big, nice, classical Resident Evil hub sort of system where you are just getting to do proper Resident Evil things, not make the mistake of going more like 5 or 6, where it's like point A to point B. Now you're in a new section, point A to, and time again, that's where the series went wrong. I did worry about that a little, even though we'd seen, I think, especially after the early section, where Leon and Grace first meet.
Yeah.
And at that point, you think, oh, they killed off the stalker already. And it was like, oh, we're doing the Dimitrescu thing again, aren't we? Like that. Because obviously we had seen like the chunk enemy as well, like in this settings, that made me think, oh, okay. So maybe we're just doing like one after the other. But again, nice subversion for that, where they do that and then come back to it later, and you actually get to do it in a whole new way. And I like that it was some restraint, where it was not just like all stalker bits all the time, and kind of giving more prominence to the smaller enemies and making them feel like a threat in many different ways.
Yeah, I think that for me, like this is a great example of how I think that this game overall succeeds in, the way that it chooses to split the experience between Grace and Leon, and that this is an environment, the top half we're talking about, or the ground floor, where it feels like it's perfectly designed with her pacing. Because as we said in the beginning, right, this is um, the portion of the experience where it's much more survival horror focused. It's slower. Like, sure, you could pop off if you want to, but that's not going to go very well early on because of the fact that her firearm does very little damage, and so it
Yeah.
really is about sneaking around the environment and really taking your time and whatnot. And so, I think for me, what that does is it really makes me become familiar with the environments because the first portion of the game has a much smaller or slower rather
Yeah.
pacing, and so you have to become very familiar with the environment because of the fact that you have to memorize the layout really well and whatnot. And so for those reasons, I think that it does a good job of having some depth to it in terms of like the layout of things. And I think that what it does well, it is evocative of past Resident Evil games. Whether it's Castle Demetris or even to a degree like the RCPD police station, right? Because of the fact that you've got this sort of like grandiose woodwork interior and whatnot. You might not think it from looking at it from the outside, but once you're actually in there, and of course, they've got the variety of puzzles that you would expect from a Resident Evil game. But um, for me, again, like I think that as is the case with a lot of Resident Evil games, they do such a good job of establishing like an elegant, sinister vibe, if you will. The fact that it has again this really almost like antiquated architecture and decorum, and yet they've got some pretty some pretty sinister happenings going on within that building or facility and whatnot. And I think that overall, what makes that setting work so well is that stalker enemy, right? And the fact that that stalker enemy, which it reminded me a lot actually of fictional games, is the bunker. The fact that you have this enemy that responds to noise. So, there's the emphasis right there for not using your gun because you will attract the beast, if you will. But also just like the fact that when you're looking around this environment, there's all of these like holes in the ceiling and whatnot that the monster will just appear from. And so I found that like that was such a smart approach, but at the same time, you add a layer of complexity to it because you have the shambler zombies, if you will, that Grace can kill. But at the same time, again, you're not incentivized to do that until you reach a certain portion of the game. But before you actually like get your handgun, you've got that brief portion early on where it really is all about light management, and you have to navigate basically this small wing of the hospital by using bottles to basically lure the stalker enemy, and then at the same time, like you get to a certain area and you throw on the light switch so you can interact with the puzzle here or there or whatnot. But I just really loved the fact that they had this sort of duality of Grace's portion of the game where it's like you're contending with something you can't kill, but then you have these sprinklings of enemies that you can, but that doesn't make the game, the like approach really change much. Combat is a deterrent, but it's not a very viable one for a majority until maybe you start upgrading Grace a bit more.
Yeah, and I think the key in making them feel so different is it because of Grace's limitations, her covering space is a lot longer than it is for Leon. Obviously, so you can literally just sort of glide for a room, take everything out, blah 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 blah, doing fancy moves. But for Grace, it's like every decision can come down to, well, do I take 30 seconds and just take this one enemy out properly, or do I just sneak around and maybe take a little longer, or just wait for a while and see if I can find an opening. And there's no real right answer with it. Again, combining like ideas of old, like, and being a bit mocking with it, like giving you a gun eventually and saying, okay, so now you can shoot the zombies and it's great. and then introducing the hemolytic injectors, obviously, which, when injected to these zombies, like, it makes their blood blow up, like in Ready or Not. And it's in that moment that you go, why is that an option? Why do I have to dispose of the body, sort of thing?
Mm.
And of course, anyone with Resident Evil history is like, oh, like, and you realize that yes, it is the Resident Evil remake thing all over again. And suddenly you start counting up all the zombies you've taken down so far and thinking, oh, and of course, limitations mean you can't really make that many of these injectors. And I think it's after a certain point in the game where you like have Grace has another encounter with Gideon, like where another phase starts, and that's when you start getting like the blister head zombies, which basically just have this eruption of like tumors on their heads after they've died, and they reanimate for a second time. And like Crimson Heads in remake, they're faster, they're meaner, they're a lot harder to take down. And of course, Grace has such a limited arsenal that the only real thing that can take him out in one shot is the Requiem gun, which is Leon's like basically one shot cannon, which again limited ammo. Like you say with the bunker, it's that sort of having a limited amount of ammo to just deter rather than to really fix the problem long term, because it causes problems depending on what you use it for. Like as we find with like the girl, the stalker, that we learn early on, that, oh, okay, so we thought it was dead, it had its head blown off, and then it comes back and it's all regenerated, and you realize, okay, so we've got a problem here in that regard. And so that's it. It's like, just as you give Grace enough power, you push back and say, well, actually, like, here you go, you're going to have to deal with a lot more. And it really did just recreate that tension and that dread of playing remake, where every time you turned a corner and saw a corpse that you'd forgotten about, and average sort of time done for, it gets up and you're like, shit. But I mean, the lead up is a bit better with this, where obviously you get like, they start convulsing, and it's like the second you see that, it's like, I got to, because you can run, in most cases they don't follow. Once you get to the hub, you're pretty safe and stuff. But it's like in most cases they'll be somewhere you want to be, and you don't want to get the damage done.
Yeah, that was the thing, right? About like getting this this Requiem, which is essentially like the zombie killing equivalent of Dirty Harry's 44 Magnum, but even larger. It's the thing where you get this super powered weapon with the character that is the lesser of the two portions of the game in terms of like strength wise or combat ability wise, and yet it doesn't end up being the game changer that you might think it is, which I think is a really great job in terms of like balancing again the two sides of this experience. The fact that as Grace, that it's more about your ability to observe environments. It's about your way to like sneak through environments and thinking about creative ways in which you can do that. Even when you have this devastating firearm that when you get to the Leon portion of things, it's like, that's as advertised in terms of its effectiveness. But with Grace, sure, I guess you could use it on the fodder enemies, but that would be a waste. But even when you're faced with this, seemingly unkillable foe, it's a temporary deterrent rather than a solution, which I think is really great. And additionally, so like you even encounter, and I think it was maybe not utilized as much as it should have been, but you come across like a mutated version of a zombie that's essentially like a shrieker that will scream and basically like stun Grace for a moment. And like that I thought was really cool because of the fact that, again, you're playing with the T virus and you have this general understanding of it, but you're giving certain enemies this kind of like little tweak to them that makes them a little bit more of a formidable foe, even when you feel that, I've leveled up enough, I've got enough resources, I can handle anything. But I think maybe like that specific enemy, or even just like not having more enemies similar to that, was maybe a little bit of a missed opportunity in that regard. But then again, you've got this stalker enemy and you've got this chunk enemy that pop up at various points of her experience. And I think that does a good job of sort of keeping the tension going and building in new and different ways. And
Yeah.
like you had said, the head boil zombies, if you will, like again, much like the Crimson Heads, much like the second stage of the Las Plagas in RE4 with the basically like tendril head enemies. I think it does a good job when you have to backtrack, through specific environments, because all of a sudden you've got this new threat. And I think that does a good job kind of like keeping that environment fresh and presenting new combat challenges that don't feel like they are, I don't know, like artificially introduced, if you will, and whatnot. I guess, something that we were theorizing about was that blood collection system for Grace before we played the game. And, that's essentially giving her the ability to craft items. Crafting has been an aspect of Resident Evil for a minute now, being able to make weapons, being able to make ammunition and whatnot, and herbs and these things. But how do you have a crafting system for someone that has no combat experience? What do you think that kind of like added to Grace's side of the experience, whether from a gameplay side of things or just like a challenge side of things, I suppose?
I mean, as a system, it's fine. I just think like the basis of it's just a bit daft. Like in terms of like, I mean, Leon's isn't much better. It's like here, points for prizes thing. It's like it's still like okay, it's the gamey side of thing, doing the wink, wink, nudge, nudge the player. Like, we're putting real thought into all these other things, but also we're going to do goofy game shit, which is great, and you should do it. But it does feel like a bit odd at first. It's like you've spent all this beginning bit like really showing how like normal she is and how hard this is and all this other stuff, and then suddenly it's like, yeah, you can use blood to make bullets and things and injectors, and it's like, okay, fair enough, and finding scrap, and yeah, I mean, having a little system like that is good because of the reasons I said, where it's like, because of the enemies and the unpredictability of what the game throws at you, you kind of have to strategize. And I think this is when you do find like the rare metals that you can make more like Requiem bullets with, for instance, which is, again, they're rare metals, so you don't find it very often, but you start thinking, well, okay, certainly your second playthrough, you're like, well, I know what they'll really be useful for. If I take the heads off the normals early on, they can't come back. Simple as that. And that's great. And you don't have to go and using any hemolytic injectors on them for it. And the beauty of that gun, by the way, is that, you can line up 2, 3 of them in a row and take them all out in one. And it's fantastic. But so lovely stuff on replay that you get strategy like that. I think the crafting system works for that as well, because once you sort of learn all the tips and tricks of it, you start strategizing how you use that, when to use it. The inventory management side of it, where you're like, for Grace, it's very classic Resident Evil, sort of like you only have a few spaces. What can you do like that with that space? And you want to be able to carry everything you might need, but you can't, so you've got to make sacrifices. And again, this helps you learn the layout of the buildings and the areas much quicker, I think, because you're like, well, I can go from here to here. I know I've got this place here. There's a chest here or whatever. And I can, do all that without needing this, that, or the other. And yeah, I like that about it. It's like, sure, you could say, oh, it's time wasting and like making you go back and forth for things as you figure stuff out. But that's the puzzle of Resident Evil. That's the fun. You get to figure these things out, figure out how to survive. That's the idea of any Resident Evil game. And yeah, they do such a fantastic job with that. So yeah, while the underlying idea, of like using blood to craft and stuff is daft, I think the system itself is useful in the way that Grace uses it.
Yeah, I love that system because of the fact that it adds an extra emphasis on combat for a character that, by all accounts is not designed with combat in mind. And a big part of that is that the hemolytic injector, like you mentioned, the fact that, if you sneak up on an enemy and you stab them with it, much like you would with a knife, it makes them bubble up and then they literally just explode. It's like you've got the bloody disgusting perk from Fallout, basically, because you get these horrific explosions of zombies and monsters in general, but also, you do have these buckets of blood that are kind of like hilariously scattered throughout environments that if you don't want to use combat, that could always be the way in which you choose to collect blood so you can craft, but that's not going to be as viable always because of the fact that those are in a limited quantity. So it really does create this emphasis that otherwise there might not be to engage in combat. And I think that that's, again, like a smart ability to like, or smart utilization, I suppose, of like not shoving one play style down the player's throat, but at the same time, it's all about options. And, while I don't know, I guess in terms of like a logic for something, I don't really think about that here because of the fact that like so much of Resi is illogical. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So it's like, okay, cool. Whatever. I don't really care about that. But I think for a gameplay side of things, like, oh, okay, that is it's more about function over, I suppose, like making a lick of sense in the general scheme of things. But I do think also that, I played through on like whatever was classic mode, if you will. But, if you were to go back and replay on like Insanity or something, given that Grace's weapons are so underpowered, that analytic injector really is the kiss of death for anything she encounters other than, a stalker enemy. And even later on in the game, when you get to the more nostalgia heavy bits where there might be an old foe that likes to climb on the walls and lick you that you might be encountering, like that is the number one tool against them in those sections for her, other than maybe like the acid, which, again, we'll talk about that. But I think, so speaking as somebody that, has been a fan of both sort of phases or identities of Resi, I really enjoyed Grace's section of, the first part of the care center because of the fact that it did feel like the best sort of example of that for me. Because, as much as I liked Village, it was, it had moved away from what I liked so much about the pacing and the tone of Resi 7. Because it was a little bit more action oriented, which is not bad for that experience, but it just wasn't in line maybe with the direction I was hoping for. But
and Ethan had turned into like an anime hero. Like at that point, it's like the guy who went from being like an everyman who doesn't know what he's got himself into to suddenly, I've just accidentally murdered this centuries-old demon. Like no biggie, like sort of thing. It's even though we know the reasons behind that, it's just like like again, that's something the story does play with nicely here. This sort of expectation that any new character introduced must have some sort of connection with the past in some way and must have some sort of dark secret that makes them special, like that, which is a thing they play up in this game a lot with Grace, and sort of the way they go against it is quite fascinating. But giving her so much time at the beginning and making sure that the portions that you do play as Leon are very short, I think are really important because she needs that time and she gets to feel like she's in the proper Resident Evil game. And I think my only complaint at that time is that maybe they overplay like the whimpering and the shuddering voice, thing, as breathing as she's going around. Like it feels a bit over the top at times, and much the same way it's slightly comical when she goes full on Morty from Rick and Morty in the way she's what do I do sort of thing every 5 minutes. It's like I get it, she's anxious, panicking, it's great, but it's like sometimes it does just feel a bit too comic-y, like unintentionally like that. And it's a minor complaint though, because I think she's a really likable character and makes you feel more in tune with like, oh god, this is horrible sort of thing. So like to go back to it, that whole first, like, if you will, section of like dealing with the girl stalker, and like where you are pretty limited in what you have and you are trying to figure out, nothing about what works at that point beyond the fact of learning that it's sensitive to light, and just you're only given like 2-3 corridors to work around, and it feels like the longest section of the game in some ways, because you're like, oh god, like I've got to get here, I've got to get there, and the fact that they go back and kind of replay that later in the basement areas and the lower areas like that, and on a bigger scale, and make it feel just as dread-inducing, is like amazing work. I think it's again that spacing out and just like not overdoing it in the stalkeries enemy types, because there are a few in this game when you think about it, but each one comes with its own context, and Yeah, and they will feel like they're there for a reason. Yeah, and story-wise, we learn why, especially with the Road to Hill ones. Yeah, it's fantastic stuff, and yeah, I really like pretty much anything Grace had to do in this game. Like it was just not only did it feel like classic Resident Evil, but it also just felt more like a modern horror game, in a lot of ways,
Ooh.
for all the good and bad that can bring. I think, yeah, it just felt more grounded. Even though Resident Evil is very ridiculous, and that's fine. I love all the conspiracy and the nonsense that goes on in the background. It's like it's not forgotten. It's just Leon gets to deal with more of that.
Yeah, and I think that even um, with Grace's ability to basically like get these power ups, right? That you can boost her
Yeah.
vitality, you can boost her combat effectiveness. Like I I boosted all of those to the max, and I still felt underpowered in the way that I would want that character to, because of the fact that it's like if you could just level her up to the degree that she feels like an extension of Leon's like power trip fantasy portion, then
Mm.
it's kind of like almost why even bother doing this two sides of the heroic or the Resi
Yeah.
experience kind of coin thing that we're talking about here. I felt somewhat of a leg up, obviously, compared to sort of like vanilla Grace from the very beginning of the game. But I think that the whole handling of her character was very smart. I agree, about the narrative aspect of her. It's like after a while, it's like, okay, this is a bit much. Like, how many of these fucking things have I killed? Like, she still has the same reaction. But I think overall, like the handling of her character was incredibly well done. And I think that what I'm most pleasantly surprised, I don't know if pleasantly surprised is the way to put it actually, but it's like what I'm glad worked as advertised was the fact that they provided two different experiences of the overall Resi experience, which at the end of the day, I was kind of like, okay, well, is Grace's portion maybe just going to end up being a first person Resi, but it still plays like Leon's portion or the more action oriented portion? And the fact that that's not the case, I think, is overall one of the game's strongest aspects, because it justifies that design decision through execution in a way that I was so happy to see that they nailed. And yeah, I think maybe we should take a quick break. And when we come back, we can chat about like the use of Leon early on during that Grace portion. And then we can chat about Grace's underground section of the care facility before we get into Leon's more nostalgic laced portion of the second half of the experience. How does that sound?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll dive right into that first part of Resident Evil Requiem before we delve into that more nostalgia and action heavy second half and that explosive finale. But more on that in a moment. We're talking about the utilization of Grace and her half of the experience, and whether that was going to provide something that felt in contrast to Leon. And while we agreed that yes, that is the case, like Leon does periodically show up, not just in a narrative sense, but like actually letting players get to play as him early on. But it's very different compared to the second half, right? Because early on, you get these very, very like the briefest of brief sections of Leon. So, thinking back to the very opening of the game, you play as Grace when you're going to the Renwood Hotel, but then you get to play as Leon when he's going through the city streets and encounters Victor, who immediately starts a new zombie outbreak, and you get this like very akin to I think Resident Evil 6, where Leon's just running through this busy, populated city street, and there's these zombies basically, and that is introducing players to the third-person action-oriented nature of it, where Leon not only has Requiem, which is the most devastating handgun ever made, but he also uses a hatchet now. And you can, not only continue to parry enemy attacks, but enemies themselves will also carry weapons. Usually it ends up being like a spear or a piece of rebar or a pipe. And then if you kill that enemy, you can like pick that up and hurl it at an enemy to kind of like stun them and whatnot. So amongst like the early utilizations of Leon, they're much more punchy, and they kind of serve as like these brief cathartic exhales of carnage, if you will, compared to overall. Grace is more reserved and survival horror focused approach to gameplay. Like for you, like what did you think of those early uses of Leon, and did you find them to be effective? And if so, like how?
It kind of feels like an inversion of what we had with Resident Evil 4, especially in the remake, where obviously you have those sections where you're not being him, and they are more sedate, and they are more like the sections we have here with Grace. And yeah, it's like you had that inverse. Lots of spooky, scary, jumping around the corners and whatever, but then you have just these little bursts of action. Kind of, it didn't show up as it didn't stand out as much, I should say, in Village when you have the Chris sections where they are like stupidly heavy action, like compared to what Ethan had. But it was still like that, where you just have this real bite of action all of a sudden. It's all chaotic, but it's perfect that they're in small chunks for several reasons. One, like I said before, like it's the distance covered that makes them shorter. It's like because Leon can cover this space so much quicker because he's not got the fear, he's got the nonchalance. He can take out multiple zombies with ease. Of course, his sections are going to be shorter. Like it makes sense that would be the case. And I find it quite fascinating later on when you have that section where you are Leon just for a sniping section. Nothing out of the ordinary. You've seen that in plenty of games, but he's doing lots of action stuff, and really, you're getting to see what in the past would have been like the accompaniment, like running along, like doing not much, nearly getting themselves killed every 5 seconds, which makes sense for Grace because it's a lot. What's coming at her at that point? As Leon, you're there just popping heads, taking things out. I like that, and there are a lot of things in this game that remind me of Metal Gear games, but that especially reminded me of that sort of thing in Metal Gear Solid 2, of just like the Raiden Snake thing of like seeing the hero from a different angle like that, and like seeing how he's in action, how that compares to the other character, but also finding a way to show how both of them can be heroic, how they can be brave, how they can do a lot. Just obviously they're coming at it from different viewpoints in different ways. Like it is quite like that in a way because Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2 is very much a trained operative, but he's not trained in that very particular way that Snake is. Like that, he doesn't have actual experience in the same way. And Grace is very much like that to Leon, where Leon came in that day all those years ago, like a rookie, and like that. But he adapted, and she's doing the same. And I really like that. It's a really good use of Leon in those sections, and just giving you small portions, just reminding us of how badass Leon is, even at this age, even being ill. Like he's still able to just kick loads of ass and come out of a quip at the other end of it. And it's the perfect size, as I said, for what you need for Grace at that point. That she needs to have the majority of the time so that we get to know her, get to know what she can and cannot do, what she can and cannot handle. So she's still tough, but we know Leon is tougher because of course he is. He's gone through all this stuff and multiple times at this point. And it's also good in terms of like going through so much tension and stress with those early grade sections when you've had long stretches and you get to just sort of let off some steam, like have 5-10 minutes with Leon. Like, and it's perfect. It's a nice little in between. At first I wasn't sure, and it felt like it was a bit disjointed, like to have these like tiny sections here and there, like, and not really going anywhere with them. But obviously once you play the whole game, like it feels more like I see what you're going for now. And it makes perfect sense that it was set up that way.
Yeah, I think initially, like that street fight, basically, I enjoyed, right? I thought, oh, okay, this is cool pacing essentially for introducing us to both sides of what the experience will be like. But at the same time, it was paced well enough that I didn't feel like it detracted from the aspect of the experience that I thought I was going to enjoy the most, which would be Grace's side of things. Again, like And so initially I enjoyed that, but then, I did have the thought, and I chatted with friend of the show, Aaron, who was on last week about it, because he
Mm.
reviewed it for Bloody Disgusting. And so I was kind of like sharing my initial thoughts, and I hadn't finished it at that point. So I was just saying along the lines of like, yeah, like this is interesting, but at the same time, when you get to, I suppose, like the next Leon section, which is when you end up fighting Chunk, who, Grace encounters in the clinic, but you can't do shit against him because he's this massive monstrosity. But then you get to face him with Leon, and, Leon gets, he's got his pistol at that point naturally, but he's also got his shotgun, which is a fan favorite. And so, like, then you end up in this combat section, and that boss fight is so deflating. It's it's so quick. It kind of like neuters I understand that Grace is like the weaker of the two halves, but like overall, I felt that it basically neuters what was viewed previously as this like very dangerous foe and whatnot. And overall, like that section maybe is, I probably won't get the time right, but it felt like it was maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And so I felt that like that portion of Leon was like too short actually, because of the fact that, actually, I can't remember. I think that was the second portion is Leon. And then the third portion, cutaway to Leon, was when basically you've been covering Grace on the roof with the sniper rifle. And then, you end up fighting what is essentially like one of the bloater boomers from like The Last of Us in a church that's on fire. And so like that portion happens. And that also is like one combat encounter maybe, or one like siege style combat encounter. And, it was enjoyable, but as soon as it ended, I was just like, oh, fuck. Like I just spent 3 hours as Grace. Like I need a little bit more of a reprieve, I found. And so I was like quite negative, I think, early on the use of Leon, and it just being too fleeting. It's like, yeah, it's cathartic, but it's not enjoyable to the degree, because I was like, I could have used a little bit longer as him. However, to your point, the further I got into the game, that basically just kind of like completely dispelled that notion that this is not well balanced, which is what I was thinking. Because of the fact that like once you have that second portion of the care center as Grace down in, the catacombs, if you will, and then you realize, oh, okay, the next 3 hours or whatever are going to be as Leon in the more action oriented portion of the experience, then I had the full sort of picture almost. And I was like, oh, okay, this makes a lot more sense. And, something that you and I talk about a lot with horror, whether it's games or film, is that, you're not able to maintain the scares for the entirety of an experience that's outside of, whatever, a handful of hours for a game, even if that. And so to have a game such as Requiem that, the opening portions of this are largely horror based, but then to end the game with the much more action oriented nature of it, that ends up being for me like the perfect balance. And it really does feel like, again, this direction that they took complements overall, the horror of Resi, if you will, which again is like not something we usually highlight here, but I think that it makes sense given the overall structure of this game.
Yeah, it basically kind of like hourglass shaped in a way, where you, in terms of who gets what share, on either side. Grace later has small horror sections like that are akin to what Leon had. That obviously they just feel long again because like the fact that Grace is in a situation she's in and what abilities she's had. Just going back to that, like that boss fight Leon has with the chunk. I think the thing that also didn't help with that is you can obviously there's loads of stuff to read in Resident Evil games notes wise, and you can still miss stuff very easily. And the thing that misses is obviously that there are two chunks in the game, like, and the one that Grace sees is not the same as the one Leon fights. They're twins or brothers or something, and they both have different things. Like one was like just eating up everything in the building, like just bits and pieces. That's why he drops like a grenade, because one of the things he's eaten. But yeah, so it was like it wasn't until after I've reread a note, and I was like, oh, also they were brothers, sort of thing. And again, with like the context of like who was experimented on in all these ways over the years, like it's this tragedy of realizing that it's all kids, and being like experimented on in these horrible ways. And yeah, it kind of makes that sort of way they talk a bit tragic as well, like that, and the fight itself a bit tragic. But yeah, it was like, I think because there wasn't really enough context going in, and some of the best Resident Evil boss fights have kind of like giving you a lovely run up to it happening, and that really didn't. That gave us, like, as you go into that bit that Leon's in when he's in the attic, like you can
Yeah.
read a note and it's got the name on it, and it says about like the brothers and like, oh, they got this, and that's basically the clue that, oh, there's going to be another one, sort of thing,
Mhm.
like that. But yeah, obviously you could quite easily miss it or skim it and like go into that and thinking it's the same sort of fight. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but yeah, I think it was the only sort of slight miss in that really didn't help, along with that sort of early idea that, oh, these are really short sections.
Yeah, and I think that overall for that, it ends up being something that in the long term, like it,
Mm,
I suppose, like the placement of those Leon sections, it makes for a fine enough primer or reminder for when you're actually going to be taking him over. Granted,
yeah,
obviously, if you're like us and you've played all of the main series entries, basically, or you play enough games, like it's not that big of a transition going between
no,
Grace and Leon. But again, like you think about maybe people that don't have as much mileage with the series or this or that, and it's like, okay, well, at least this is a reminder periodically about like, hey, once you get to this portion of the game, it doesn't feel like you have to relearn how to play it, I suppose.
mm,
So that ends up being maybe this sort of like not exactly a tutorial, but it ends up being this aspect of it that allows players to be primed enough that when you are taking on the reins of Leon in the more action oriented things, it doesn't feel like this drastic shift, which is,
yeah.
pretty important at the end of the day. I mean, um, I don't know, suppose before we get to, a return to the original stomping grounds for our boy Leon, would you have any other thoughts about, Grace's more, lower paced portion of her exploration of the care center, whether
Yeah, I
above or
like.
below?
Well, no, I liked the whole thing because
Mm,
it goes back to that classic Resi thing, which is like, of course, oh, it's a place, and then it has a place under the place, sort of thing.
mm,
But like I
yeah.
said, it feels very much more like an after the fact sort of thing that they made, and just feel rugged and feels. You know what it reminded me of? Day of the Dead. Like in the
Oh,
underground sort of
mhm,
environment there with all the experimentation and weird stuff. And yeah, I like that. Um, Also kind of reminded me of like the prison section in Silent Hill 2 remake, like
mm,
where you had that sort of thing.
mhm,
And these are good things. I think it reintroduced that sort of nervousness that we felt with like the stalker in the first bit. Reintroducing it in that way and having to sort of relearn this, how to face it, and having this like all these puzzles to sort of get around, using the different cells to like power stuff up and working out where to put them. It flowed really well. Like I really loved that. I mean, when I played that, I was like just before I was going away for the weekend, trying to get through as much as I could, and that was like the last big section I played, before the Raccoon City stuff, and it was like, oh
mm,
yeah, it's amazing. And like I really got into it, and so yeah, I really did enjoy that. And the bit that almost gets forgotten, I suppose, is like that brief bit when you finally do escape the center,
mm,
and obviously they have that like helicopter crash after the sniper fight, like all that, and oh no, the sniper fight's after the helicopter, isn't it? Sorry.
mhm, yeah, after.
Yeah, and then you had that whole, but before you even get in the helicopter, that whole like small building where they do like a mini sort of room, like just go where you go down into that facility and
Yeah.
get the stuff, and like you have to escape with all this blood flowing and all these undead sort of coming out of every bloody orifice, and yeah, again, just like it's really interesting how the game sort of does that sometimes. Like as much as it like wants to be all resis at once, sometimes in terms of like
Mm,
having sections that are like the goofier, more action orientated stuff, and then but there's many different ways they do the classic Resident Evil experience, like in big scale, small scale, like that. It reminded me a lot of like in Resident Evil 7, where you go from the main house and then you go to the outbuildings and stuff, like
mm,
the Marguerite stuff. Like it feels like a different place. Yeah, and I like that. And of course, it really was with that one. Um, yeah, I really did enjoy that. It's like little extra sections just to get to the point, and then before we get to the main event. But yeah, I mean, the whole Roadkill thing is like probably one of my favorite sections in the modern Resi games. Like there are good bits, they're very good bits in Village. Like Beneviento's is obviously like the standout, but there's some misses in there too, and they all didn't because you can attack them in a particular way, and they all feel disconnected because it's like that hub world is open there. It's
Right.
like it doesn't work the same way here. It's like the way they structure it and having like do all this, and the objective being to get outside. It's like, well, what do you get when you get outside? And then it's like one more little reward. Like, yeah, I like that about it. It's like it offers just enough, and it was nice to like go into the underground section of a Resident Evil game and not think, oh well, this is the finale coming, sort of thing. And
Right.
coming up, I know they basically do that again later, but like it was nice again, just a subversion of the idea that, oh,
Mhm.
here we are, yeah, we're underground, we're going to find more secrets, more things. It's like, no, you get to come up again and you get to get out, and then you just sort of repeat the process, I suppose. But yeah, I think this is where the strength lies, is because of the protagonist, because of the design of that whole opening. I mean, Resident Evil games generally have quite strong opening halves, but like,
Mhm.
yeah, this was like a really good half.
Yeah, exactly. I think that again, like for me, the Requiem being just like reflective of where Resi's come from and where it's heading and where it's been. Like that, it feels like such a reflective game because of a lot of the things that you just said, right? The fact that you can have these aspects of design that present the familiar, and you might have these preconceived notions about it.
Mm.
But at the same time, like then the game subverts it by saying what typically would have been the finale of a past classical Resi game is actually just like a midway point, or it's a
Mm.
turning point. And I think that that has something to do with, again, like them taking what is the most drastic shift of gameplay, which ends up being like a hodgepodge of what's worked previously and the different directions that Resi's taken. But at the same time, like you have the overall layout and progression of the game as a whole being
Mm.
reflective of that as well. And I found that for me, like that instance with the helicopter, like, yeah, that would be the penultimate moment perhaps in a classic Resi game. And yet that just ends up being sort of this, the rug pulled out from under you. And then what do you have after that? It's like you've got naturally this, an entire facility flooding with blood that's just so over the
Mm.
top. And when I originally was in that section, I incorrectly assumed like, oh, we're about to have like a tyrant type of a fight because there's all these explosive canisters everywhere and everything. And I was like, oh, am I gonna have to run through and then throw these on the ground or shoot them or this or that? And then it ends up going in a completely different direction.
Yeah.
And for me, like that it ended up being like the type of experience that like, you more or less have a general understanding of how things progress, but I'd feel like more often than not, I was expecting something to happen that didn't happen, which
Yeah.
ended up being, a nice surprise because of the fact that, God, how many of these games have I played at this point? And it's like this game still ended up, generally speaking, had a great deal of sort of overall just like surprises in
Mm.
store, which is really, really quite a fan of because of the fact that again, it's like how many fucking underground facilities am I going to have to investigate? And yet, the pacing of those and the overall nature of a majority of them not being the penultimate moment was very refreshing. And I think thinking about that facility, you get to a portion where it's like you get basically these fire extinguishers full of that. Um, the I forget even how to pronounce it now. The hemoglyptic
Mm.
injectors. It's basically just full of that stuff. So you run around,
Yeah.
you spray these hordes of zombies with it, and they just explode in your face. Like that was such a cool moment. And again, like presenting an environment that more or less is somewhat familiar to you at this point, but you're giving players an untraditional means with which to defeat enemies to escape, and then it's completely gone after that.
Mm.
So I really loved that specific portion of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and also like final encounter with with the stalker, the girl enemy, like just
Yes.
that whole thing and that storyline. But in the moment, I thought was really strong. Like having an actual bit of tragedy there was unfortunately Resident Evil history means that they didn't die, sort of thing. Like this, like it's like you knew it was coming in a way, but in the moment it was like, oh yeah. After all that, it's kind of sad that that it ends up being that way. But even the whole fight beforehand, where it's just going around different areas trying to get everything up to do a larger form thing of like the Birkin battles, in Resident Evil 2, just like setting everything up to get him, like yeah, and having it chase you the whole time, like just yeah, I love that. It was another good example of using the enemy, who like I said in the beginning, you kind of think, oh, it's going to be like Lady Dimitrescu again, where you just get a small bit, and then but to come back again and again was more than in like your classic sort of stalker enemies in Resident Evil, where they are just like coming back again and again and again to go after you. But yeah, grand stuff. That's that whole. And yeah, I mean, at that point though, we kind of know we're supposed to be getting to Raccoon City, and I'm looking at the time plane, thinking, "Wow, it feels like I should be there already." Surely, is it just going to be like a bit of a, like you said, rug pull where you're going to be there for an hour or something like that? And I did worry that would be the case. And it would just be like, "Oh yeah, by the way, we were making this other game, but then we had to shoehorn this stuff in because 30th anniversary, and then we're just going to, which to some degree they do, but I think they at least make you wait a bit for it and have some other stuff around it too. But yeah, it's there's a sizable chunk of Raccoon City at least, and not all of it familiar, which is good.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's about the best segue you could have provided for that, us getting into the more nostalgia heavy, but at the same time, as you just kind of like indicated, like there's a good balance, I think, here in terms of the more Leon centric side of things, where, yes, you are returning to the hallowed grounds of a now nuked Raccoon City and whatnot. So even if initially it doesn't resemble the city streets that you're used to, as is indicative of the player's time there, it very quickly becomes very familiar. But yeah, so this is where the game takes a drastic shift in terms of the gameplay. Some of the things that I mentioned earlier, where it was you have a much more sort of like brief moments with Leon, is now a lot more uh, focused on just like playing as Leon. You've got this third person, more action horror centric gameplay that's more akin to like Resi 3 through 6. And, Resident Evil, I don't think is, I can't speak to maybe like 6, but this is probably like the most apocalyptic setting that Resi has had, right? Because you're basically running through these ruins, and this portion of the game for me, like my point of reference was mostly almost like The Last of Us 2, where, it's much more of being dropped into this larger area, and you kind of like have free reign to tackle these, this objective that you have, which is boils down to just like collecting cans of gas, but you just have a larger setting that early on, like the introduction to Raccoon City, I think again is like the perfect primer for the tone and the pacing overall of this portion of the game, because you get this, sprawling, massive, like 8-legged welcome party where you have to fight this mutated, spider that, thinking back to the roots of Resident Evil, like, yeah, this is not the first time we fought massive spiders, but this is by far the largest. And so, like, what did you think about that sort of, I won't say it's technically a boss fight, but maybe like a mini boss fight, if you will, kicking things off with this, return to Raccoon City?
Yeah, I mean, Leon's boss fights are definitely different anyway, I think. So it's fair that it does feel quite different to anything we've sort of gone up to that point. But yeah, I think again, it's one of those great moments where you kind of twig a little too late, like walking around this city that's dust. You mentioned Last of Us. I think Fallout as well is like another.
Yeah.
So like just in terms of how bleached out and barren everything is, and that's a wonderful atmosphere because that's how it should look. But yeah, that sort of reveal of like there being like webs in places and thinking, like that, and just like that. Yeah, when we were talking earlier about like the chunk fight and how there's no real good preamble to it, and here at least it's like, oh no, it's like this is like little hints, and it just very by giving you just enough to go, oh, does that mean? And then yeah, it pretty much just kicks in that you have this fuck off spider, and just the way that's structured, being very much more of those sort of 4, 5, 6 vibes in terms of like how it paces. Yeah, it's a good way to sort of reintroduce you to Raccoon City before you see anything familiar, and to give you an old familiar enemy, now bigger and worse. And it's intriguing, of course, because the idea is, Raccoon City should be like a wasteland, and there should be nothing left or surviving, and very quickly sort of getting shown. This is why, again, when I was saying to you, like, I didn't think there'd be much. When it was clear, obviously, they were going to Raccoon City because there was something there that they'd hidden, but like to the extent that they have, we didn't know that it would be like this. But so I really did think like the spider thing was a good way to sort of go, no, there's something more going on here. And I like that whole idea that they do come up with Raccoon City still being like active, but in a way that using like the framing of the bombing of it being a way to keep people away from it, so to speak. But the spider stuff is like proper goofy, proper Leon, and like it's fun. It's like, and I know there are some Resident Evil fans out there that kind of lamented not having spiders for a while. So yeah, I'm sure they were very, very pleased to sort of come back and have that lovely surprise moment. And yeah, one of the first things again in this whole section to me, where it's just like it's the most Metal Gear Solid 4 thing going. Like it just starts to become like old man who used to be here comes back to the place he once was, sort of thing, like that, as Snake does in Shadow Moses in Metal Gear Solid 4. Like, and we will get into more reasons why, but yeah, like that was like the first of, oh okay, so yeah, just getting like that, and yeah, fun stuff.
Yeah, they maybe should have nuked Raccoon City twice to try to avoid that, but as we'll quickly learn in this return, if you will, it's the type of thing where it's like, yeah, that'll really become pretty apparent why these things are continuing to occur. But no, I think that like for me at this point, Grace's portion of the game, it's like, yeah, that has served the purpose that it's supposed to. I'm fully all in on, now, okay, we're going to get the more action-oriented portion of things. But I think overall what I was just, really pleased with again is like, this is the indicator that like, okay, we're going to go fully off the rails now. We're going to have big mutant spiders basically filling up the entire screen and whatnot. But at the same time, like it still is being representative of aspects of design that were prevalent in like specifically like Village, right? The fact that you get this environment that's much more wide open. And one aspect that you mentioned briefly earlier, but we haven't delved into naturally, is the notion that with, while Grace's crafting is tied to, collecting blood and whatnot, Leon has the typical type of thing, which again is like taking scrap metal and blending it with gunpowder. But there's also this system where, he finds this old kind of like outpost, if you will, of
for the
soldiers.
the BSA.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So he's like going through the skeletons of them, but they've left behind these crates that every enemy that Leon kills gives him credits. Essentially, you're not picking up, money like you were in Resi 4 or something, but you get credits that are instantly dropped into your account for each kill you get. So you can spend that on ammo, tuning up weapons, or buying new guns through these crates. And that was something that, while this is the more action-oriented nature naturally of the experience, like it still rewards the player for seeking out combat, because there are enemies that once you've like returned to some sections, you're going to either deal with the blister heads, or just in general, you might have more enemies that spawn in an environment, or sometimes when you're like in the high-rise portion on tops of buildings, and you've got your sniper rifle and look through the scope, you'll see enemies patrolling on bridges in the distance or something like that. And, those are completely optional combat encounters. But at the same time, if you need extra money for wanting to upgrade this, that, or the other, that option is there. And on the harder difficulties, naturally, even if this is the more action-oriented side of things, ammo conservation is still a factor. But I just kind of liked that notion that, combat is never viewed as wasteful, I suppose. And I think for me, like, I said to you before we were recording, as soon as I finished playing through Requiem, I reinstalled the Resi 4 remake because I needed more Resi. And so that, again, is one of those things where it's like the majority of the time when you kill an enemy, you might not always get ammo, but you will get those funds. And that kind of like further instilled in me to go seek out other combat instances other than just, for like the love of the game, but like I actually get a reward out of it. Because naturally there's no stat upgrades or leveling up unless you dump money into, upgrading weapons and whatnot. So that was like one of those little things that I was appreciative of. And I think also like in terms of the types of enemies that you fight in this, and it was something, again, we chatted about briefly when we were covering that sort of like Resi 9 overview media day that they had. Like one of the things that's very apparent here that is not necessarily new, but it's more indicative of like the Baker clan, but for the Shambler zombies, is that those infected with like the T virus and whatnot will retain some of their former self. And you see that a lot in the care center, right? You see people that were patients, people that were nurses. As Grace, you come across one that is, preoccupied with scrubbing and cleaning floors and whatnot, and will like say as much in their sort of like banter to themselves. But here in Leon's side of things, like that comes across in combat. You'll find enemies that are lugging spears or bits of rebar, and like you can get them to drop it by killing them or just by downing them, and then Leon himself can use them. So like there are some new aspects to combat. I wouldn't say they're drastic, but at the same time, like just giving players more options. That's what I'm trying to say. This like long-winded way of saying that, like giving players more options is always a good thing. And for that to be in Resi, while not kind of like redefining the overall experience, I think is like pretty remarkable for, again, the 9th main series entry in a series. It's like just giving players more options rather than just kind of like rewriting how Leon plays or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think it's basically building on everything they've done in the last 10 years in sort of redoing the series with new games and old, and finding sort of ways to mix everything together. And this is the first of the mainline games in that period where it has felt like they've learned from everything they've done and gone, okay, so we're going to add all of this together now. And it's, in a way, it's quite welcoming, because when you think of game dev back in like the early 2000s onwards, every game was like teaching them lessons for the next one. And like you get spin-off games, small games, like we said this before about Rockstar, where stuff like Bully, stuff like Manhunt, even later stuff like Max Payne 3 would basically pave the way for stuff they were experimenting with for the games that were coming up. And that was great. And in a way, Capcom have been able to do that with the remakes, change things up, not always for the better, sure, but generally speaking, doing some cool stuff, new ideas, adding, I mean, and pretty much all of those ideas are here, like in one way or another, which, yes, does make it feel like a greatest hits package a lot of the time. So it's not revolutionary, as you said, but it does mean it's like the most refined sort of Resident Evil of modern times. It's like, it's not classical, it's not fully modern, it's like a bit of both. It's mixed in a way that feels a lot smoother than any of the games that have come before. They've been slowly addressing certain issues of like the pivot to another character and things like that, and slowly sort of building us towards that idea. And in a way, that's probably a plus point as well for having someone like Ethan, who's a bit more of a blank slate compared to the rest, is that, it meant they didn't have to saddle him with a lot of the same sort of story baggage and stuff like that, and certain ideas about what he could and couldn't do. He's very much been like a great place to sort of experiment with stuff. So yeah, I think Leon sections, as much as they feel like 4, and 4 remake especially, I do think that there's little bits to it that bleed in from the other stuff, the more survival horror based stuff, the manner in which the hub goes, using bits of what Village did well, as you said, and it just the verticality of that place as well, with those high-rise sections, with those little puzzle bits, and again making a space that is relatively small in a city feel big,
right?
But feel like it's got ironically life in it, and just give it sort of these cool little set pieces here, there, and everywhere. I mean, it's predictable, sure, in terms of like you do this, you go here, you have to switch this thing on, turn this up, whatever, and the second you do that, something's going to happen. That's it. And the joy of it, it's just like that wonderful little loop. And as I said, it's the point in the game where you sort of go, okay, now I see, now I get it, and now I get the balance of this thing, like that. Getting to play again, like what is by definition of the other Resident Evil games, a small version of what 4 did, but still significant enough that it takes up a few hours, is wonderful. Like that, it just all those cool little sections, all the doomy nature of it, just like the dried out undead that appear, stuff like that early on, like the ones that come out of the ground and stuff, like from the rubble. Like it's fantastic stuff. Like it feels so different, and really just does sound like a place that was like sort of abandoned, in a way, especially on the outskirts, where you really are just, there's not much going on, but you're kind of getting the ripple effect of whatever's going on in the middle.
I think I won't beleaguer the point, but like I'm on record about my love for the Resi 4 approach to gameplay, but like that just rings true here even more so. Like I love the action oriented nature of how Leon handles here, like to be more in line with like not entirely Grace's portion, but at the same time, like, and going from Requiem to now replaying the Resi 4 remake, like Leon doesn't move as quickly as he does in Resi 4, but it is a little faster paced, but also just like his weapon handling. I love the fact that, you can obviously take those aimed shots, but also if you get hit and then press the aim button, you can do this kind of like quick snapshot aim with like a shotgun or whatever. And there were so many instances where how fucking satisfying is that, especially with like a shotgun or something to the face of whatever is attacking you, and it just
that zoom in, and like the quick animation of him just like literally just jamming it in their face and just blasting away. It's like, God. I mean, that shotgun is, all variants of the shotgun are fucking amazing anyway, but oh boy, that was the best thing about playing as Leon. It's just all that shotgun stuff was just immaculate, but those context animations really did just make it feel more like intense and like a fight that's so much. It's amazing how much they sort of evolved from what they did with Resident Evil 4 remake, in terms of like that, the flow of combat, and how I suppose the only criticism you could have is that you don't really get to understand it until late in the game, which because you don't get that time with him to sort of do it. It's like the parry thing's like weird to get back into, because every time you're with Leon, it's for such a short period that by the time you come back to him, if you're not using it or you've forgotten because it's been hours. And so that was slightly a downgrade on maybe what we had before, in that you don't get used to it. But I think again, it's one of the many things that on replay works better once you have that knowledge, which again, the best Resi games do. You will have stuff to learn in another playthrough. And one of the smart things the game does, whilst not having a proper new game plus, is that it does give you like access to that bracelet system early on for Leon, so he can unlock stuff earlier. You don't have to sort of rush your way through certain paths, and it gives you a bit more experimentation. But but yeah, oof, the shotgun stuff, great. And the sniper I think was underutilized, but I think it had its moments. It was quite good to use, and the fact you can use it without a scope as well. It is great.
Yes. Yep. I mean, I got that the semi-automatic one from one of those supply crates, basically, that you can unlock in that portion, and I got a charm for my gun that basically increases the firepower of it if you don't use a scope. So that ended up being like my go-to, and that was a fucking fundamental part of my Requiem experience, and just so devastating and so great to use against bosses, to the degree that like it almost eclipsed the shotgun for me, because of the fact that it was like, it's versatile, obviously close range and long range without the scope. And so it was the type of thing where I was just like, all of a sudden, this is just like a devastating part of my arsenal that I think I ended up like not even using the SMGs that you get, because of the fact that it's like, why even bother? It deals so little damage, and I would rather just have that equipped, and naturally, like, is a continuation from the more action oriented ones. If you don't have certain guns in your arsenal or in your inventory, then you're less likely to find ammo for them. So I'm going to be using this and the shotgun and the pistol, and from there, I was good to go. I ended up using like the Matilda a lot because I unlocked that early on, and that was my go-to, and just like maxing it out. But I will say, like, the one thing that I kind of missed was there were not as many, obviously, weapon options as in something like Resi 4. And, naturally with Resident Evil 4, you didn't end up using all of them, but it was still nice to have this option of just like this bevy of guns that kind of like fit every sort of like play style, if you will. So that's one thing that maybe like combat wise, I could have used a bit more of. But yeah, let's maybe chat about some of our memorable bits from the outskirts of Raccoon City before we get into the official return to the stomping grounds for our boy Leon Kennedy.
I think it's towards the end of that where you've basically got to get down off that rooftop, and you're going. Again, one of those things where you know what's coming, like, and it's going to be one of those elevator style boss battle things, or you have to take on a bunch of enemies like that. But it's no less intense for it. Like that, what I like about the presentation of that as you're going down on this, like, what is it, like one of those window washer lift style things, like, but through the middle of like a building, and so all around you, you've got like these windows where all the dehydrated undead are just like at the windows and like kind of clawing out of it, and then some of them are dropping down, and you get blister heads and other kinds, and the idea is you can knock them off this small platform you've got, and it's just like it just boils everything down to this intense small area of like using Leon's parry and using the hatchet, knocking enemies into each other and stuff like that, and one of the undersold things about this game is like getting enemies to fight each other by accident, like in certain sections, like back in the hospital where you have like the blind ones which will swing around if you throw stuff in certain directions, and they'll just hit other enemies as a result without either trying. That small section and just knocking them off left, right, and center, and then at the end of it, it falling and you having to sort of run quickly through the like zombie infested underground back up into the light. It's like, considering it wasn't like a camera controlled set piece cutscene type thing, it was really well like managed in terms of like how it presents the action around you as it happens. And one of the few moments in a Leon part of the game where you feel oh shit sort of thing like that, it really ups that intensity. Yeah, I love that, and it felt like the great payoff for that whole sort of search for the the explosives thing that's going to get you out of this area. Like all these little mini fights and mini sections you have to end it on that, yeah, beautiful. Though just before that, as well, that when you are high up and that building sideways and you're on the plate glass stuff with the windows, yeah, and just like able to shoot out sections beneath them, but if you do too many, you'll collapse the whole thing and not end up falling to your death, sort of thing. Yeah, that was cool as well. Just so yeah, I think for me, just because one of my favorite old games in terms of like survival horror that wasn't horror was Disaster Report, SOS, The Final Escape, as it was known in this
Mm.
country,
Mhm.
which followed all the survival horror things, but it was about natural disaster. So there was lots of stuff like that, with high rises and making sure not to fall to your doom from things, and like it reminded me so much of that at times.
Yeah.
I was like, which made me pine for like having a game that looked that good doing that. But yeah, like so yeah, it was just it's reasons that as grey and lifeless as the environment was, it was, as I said, it had a life to it because
Mm.
the way the game is structured, it just shows it's like presentation is important, but it's only boring if you don't have anything to do in it, like that.
Right.
They really do make the most of that section and just give you so much to play with the Leon sort of toy box.
Yeah, I think that again, like this portion of the game early on, like, and furthermore, once we'll get into more of his nostalgia portion of the experience, like it really just revels in the strengths that are inherent to that. And I feel like it is very unreserved, I think, in just how into the weeds it gets with that. Like, I mean, from the aspect that you mentioned with like going through the high rise and you've got to like, you can shoot out the glass underneath the feet of those heavily armored zombies, which some of them can like shoot or they have grenades. Like that section when you go through a warehouse and the zombies basically just rise from the ground. Like that was one of the that was so cool. And again, like to your point about mentioning Day of the Dead, I felt very Day of the Dead-esque. The fact that these things that have been dormant for so long, all of a sudden it's like they've just been waiting for a new victim to pop up.
Yeah, sorry, just to interject there, it's like, and it reminds me of in Demons 2, that movie within a movie thing they're doing on
Yes.
TV,
Yep.
where they're going back to the place where it all happened, like
Yeah.
that. And yeah, it was like, oh man, someone's watched Demons 2. Like it's
Mhm.
like it just definitely. So sorry, go on.
No. That was a good shout. That's more accurate than the Day of the Dead. But also, like one aspect that I really enjoyed that is not something that probably previously I would have enjoyed, but I think because it was used so sparingly was that motorcycle chase sequence with Leon and when Victor, because of the fact that it's just the one scene, but at the same time, like it is so over the top and indicative of like the RE5 and 6 influence and the fact that you not only have this like machine pistol that you can just like spout off rounds with, but also like you're going between shooting at Victor, but then also you've got these rabid zombified T-virus dogs that are hounding you, and it's so over the top, and it's very much like the anime, probably the most anime centric portion of the experience.
Yeah, this is
But
for me
it's
where
just
it really
awesome.
started becoming quite MGS4-esque. Like it is,
Sure.
from that section on, it
Yeah.
was like, yeah, like a guy in a long coat in a chase and a motorcycle, like mad shit going on. Yeah, absolutely brilliant stuff. And yeah, just this is what I was mentioning. Like from here onwards, like for a large stretch, it just like it's like the Shadow Moses bit in MGS4.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's zero reservations here about just how ridiculous things are going to get, and it really is too. Like at that there's several instances during that chase sequence where the overpass is falling apart or entire buildings are falling over and you're riding up the side of them. It's just like that anime moment of like you had this huge battle and then the villain's just like, you haven't seen anything yet, and that's like the true start of it, and it just
Yeah.
completely continues to snowball into the fucking lunacy of the other half of Resident Evil, which has not always been my bag, as I've said, but I think that here, like it again, it's all about the pacing. The pacing for me with this really, really works so incredibly well. And it makes aspects of this work in a way where if this was a 12-hour game just of those types of moments, it would not. But here
No.
again, like you've got the two sides of the experience, and for me, like that is a perfect equalizer and balance overall, I think, to those things that previously were pretty overkill. But for me here, they're terrific.
So I suppose we should get into the big thing here, which is
Yeah.
the return to the bit of Requiem City we do remember and
Yeah.
do know. Which, what I just said about like presentation and how the game frames things, this probably could have done with a little more reining in just on that moment,
Mhm.
because I wasn't looking the right way when I walked up to the front gates of the RPG. Like, and I just turned around like, oh, I'm here, like sort
Yeah.
of thing. And
Mhm.
so I didn't quite get like the willies in the way I thought I would. But then to be honest, yeah, as much as I'd seen stuff in the trailers and that, but it was like it was one of those things thinking, well, there's not going to be much of it. We're not really going to be in it for very long, and it's just going to be whatever we need to get to is going to be in it, whatever. But
Yeah.
the fact that we do get to go in, this is like Capcom's really smart reuse of assets, like over and over again. Like, it was the best thing they did about the remakes alongside doing 7, is that they do reuse a lot of the same assets, and
Mm.
it's a cheaper, more effective way to make the games, I guarantee. And so maybe it didn't quite have the same impact like going back at first, like, because we've only seen this a few years ago, so it's not really 28 years or whatever, like in the same way. And obviously visually it's very different, but I don't. It was once it was going a bit longer and seeing more of it and seeing the bits that survived, and then like that sort of goading use of like the welcome banner that was left behind for him on that night. And so it's obviously the thing we get to is like where it really does just start going into the remember this thing, and like we'd had the spider fine, we'd seen the front gates, we'd walked around a bit, and that's great. But I tell you what, as much as you want to roll your eyes at things that are like designed to like poke the nostalgia bear, and how because of certain movies and things like that, the idea of that is so exhausting that you kind of feel cynical about it whenever it comes up. But it's not so much about the fact that things do that as the way they're applied, where there's a lot of films and games that will do it in a really lazy legacy way of going, like, like I think I talked to you off air last week about the idea of what Scream did when like they reveal that like in Scream 5 is you're in Stu Macher's house, sort of thing, like yeah, you didn't reset that up very well, sort of thing. And
Right.
it's like it's the use of legacy being just there because it makes money. Here it's very much, I don't know, it's indulgent, very self-indulgent in terms of how it does it. But God, did my jaw drop on the Mr. X thing. Like sure, logically you could go, well, how the fuck does that work, sort of thing, at that point, especially like that. But at the same time, that new context of the Leon of now facing the thing of then was really interesting. And of course, how that battle is different, compared to how it was all those years ago, because of being honest. And just the whole chase through and like, oh god, I love that. I liken it to like the difference in Terminator to Terminator 2, like man versus machine, then it's machine versus machine, almost like that, and how the playing field's a little more level, but not entirely. I mean, it blows into the over ridiculous when you get to the second part of that fight, where it does start to become Devil May Cry, and Leon is literally fighting an evolved version of Tyrant, and it's like, but fuck it, it was dopey and it was joyous in that moment. Like I was like, yeah, that's fine, love it, that'll do. Like, and it was a nice way to sort of end it as well, that section.
Well, so this is the thing, right? With the way that the game handles the nostalgia, is that I don't have a problem with returning to, the Raccoon City Police Department. I don't have a problem with the banner. I don't have a problem with fighting, the Titan Spider, Mr. X, Plant 43, maybe Punk later on. But like the only aspect of it that did not work for me were two things, and that was like the flashbacks from Resi 2 remake. Like I felt that those were, even if, someone is not as versed in Resident Evil's history as we are, or fans of the franchise, like that just felt like one step too far. It felt akin to almost like, I don't know, those like Avengers movies towards the end where it's like we had to get a flashback to everything. We had to have something along those lines in basically every single scene. to remind people like, hey, remember this? And it's like, yeah, we remember, but you don't have to literally show us. I mean, it's indicative of like the worst of 80 slashers, right? Where the first
Yeah.
10 minutes of every Friday 13th film opened with the last 10 minutes of the previous film type of a thing.
Yes.
So there was like way too much of that, I thought. And additionally, like, I'm not sure how it landed for you, but like there was this entire on rails section at the orphanage that I thought was completely unnecessary in regards to just like having control of the character during that, because of the fact that it was like on rails, highly scripted, just at odds with the rest of the experience. I would have rather that had been just like a cutscene almost. And so like for me, those were the aspects that I thought were pretty grating, and they kind of like were a detriment to the overall pacing of this portion of the game. I don't have a problem with myself being in control and exploring the bones, if you will, of places that I know the significance of or I've already experienced it myself. And if anything, like because of the tone of this portion of the game, the fact that I'm going to refight, Mr. X or the Super Tyrant or Titan, and he's throwing missiles at me. It's like, well, fucking whatever. Like we've already established this is going to be over the top, so that doesn't bother me. Which is funny because I read an article from someone that said like that was the portion that almost made them stop playing the game, and it was like, oh, fucking okay. Like Resident Evil has not been about subtlety for a very long time, so this was one of those things where they didn't lead with being overly self-indulgent or almost like masturbatory in terms of like their own legacy and the lineage of Resident Evil. So that stuff really didn't bother me at all. And again, like it's presenting it in this new, I forget how you put it, but it was, in my opinion, like Mad Max-esque lens of Raccoon City almost. So, it's not new, but it's a return to the familiar through a new lens almost. So for those reasons, like I did not have as much issue with the nostalgic heavy portion of it, but the flashbacks I found to be incredibly overbearing, and not so much beating you over the head with it, but like blowing your head off like Leon did with so many of those zombies with a shotgun. It was a bit too much.
Yeah, I think one of the problems the second half has is it's the one that's definitely designed for people who've obsessed over Resident Evil. Like the details are there, and the one thing it doesn't do that a lot of the pandering legacy stuff does in many games and films is it doesn't go out of its way to explain stuff. The flashback stuff is almost like odd in that regard because it's there. I mean, to be fair, again, when I go back to MGS4, that literally had a button to play the flashback thing, like during those scenes. But at the same time, here, like it's they kind of just assume stuff like some of the time, and that the orphanage section is like big, really, like in terms of like explaining who Xeno is, explaining a lot of things, like and I mean, I don't think that section will necessarily hold up on a replay, but I think when I talk about the inverse of like, oh, big action, big dumb action, big silly Leon stuff, and then going back to a small bit of grace, maybe it doesn't work quite as well that way around, like as it does like the other one. But I think I did like the idea. Like I quite like the sort of the small scale version of the puzzling, do this, find that stuff. It was a little too, as you say, scripted, like to the point where I literally had to go back and forth on one section just to activate whatever was going on, like, and because the orphan would not get out of the way of the fucking door I had to go through, like that, and that sort of annoying. But it did get to show me the death animation, which was not pleasant. But like, but yeah, I did like that in terms of what it does to the like overarching lore of Resident Evil. Like that was great. Like, and the giggly red-eyed children thing. Ooh, yeah, that was quite creepy. Like it, and so yeah, I liked what it was doing. I think it's them trying to find a different way to use the orphanage, like in that time, because obviously, in the present day, it's fucked. So it's like it's not really anything to see. But yeah, that was cool. And again, just to see a portion of Resi history that wasn't after 98, and
Mm.
all that. So that was cool. Yeah. And just sort of the context of it. Yeah, I like it a lot. And yeah, but like I said, it does really rely on the person playing it having a lot of knowledge of Resident Evil stuff over many, many years. And again, going back to a lot of this game's problems when it does do that is, yeah, just does not explain stuff well enough in a way that is working for everybody.
Mm.
And yeah, so that section, yeah, I've seen a lot of criticism of it, and yeah, I think it's probably the weakest section in terms of being a game, but I do think it's, yeah, a palate cleanser of sorts before you get into like the proper end game of stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine playing through that portion as somebody that doesn't have a history with the series, like fans of the franchise do, because so much of that probably would have just been like, I don't know about a bore, but it would have just been like this big shrug, like what the fuck, what is this? Like, what is the significance? Like, obviously
Yeah.
the game gives you some context, but at the same time, like that is it. But here's the thing, like again, like I think that it's the placement of it that is appropriate.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that you get to this portion clearly, the connection and the history between Leon and Sherry with Raccoon City has been established. But at the same time, like you can't ignore the fact that like for people that are not especially well versed, they might just this portion would just be a big shrug probably.
Yeah, yeah, and then, like I said, it's probably that frustrating mix. Like I said, it was like it's not being quite as dumb and pandering in a way that most things are when they do that,
Mm.
but it's not explaining itself well enough either. So
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, it kind of caught frustrating a lot of people in that way. And the whole back half of the game can often feel like that. And when we get to the endings, there's a thing about that that's just like why sort of thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, but so yeah, after that whole bit, we go down to the bowels of Raccoon City, and because there's this whole other facility down there, and we get that, as you said, another sort of encounter with like the descendants of Plant 42, effectively, which has just taken root in the underground, and that was a nice surprise. I mean,
Yeah.
because it was black tentacles at first. Well, the first things you think of are like Resident Evil 7 and like the mold and stuff, thinking. But again, the game doesn't explain things very well sometimes. So unless you know that, you're probably going to say that. But yeah, it was once it was in the idea of what it is. Oh, okay, so yeah, this makes sense now. And yeah, that was a cool little aside to just get down there and have something to do as you sort of, rather than just like a solemn climb down sort of thing. And it was nice seeing like all the blowout of what happened, and like seeing like rail cars and stuff, and yeah, so it was a fun little section. Yeah, I mean, beyond that, it's just like a wink and a nod sort of thing, and it's like basically the guard dog effectively for the arc, this place, and that whole arc section again is like it's like we took the long way around to get to the end, in that regard, where where you have the shiny facility underneath the city sort of thing, and doing that back in Raccoon City, that was like weirdly the most nostalgic thing for me of all. It was like, even though it's not the same facility, even though it's a whole different story and a whole different thing, it was the whole having gone through the RPD and then going underground and then into a facility like that that's all clean and sterile but has all this fucking death and destruction in it. Wonderful. And then seeing the things in it, oof. That was a whole yeah.
I mean, this is the thing, right? For me, is that I found that this portion of the game was what I really wanted from, I think, overall, because of the fact that, while it's presenting, it's like, oh, go figure, there's another facility that you didn't know about that was below Raccoon City and whatnot. But more importantly, what I think that this portion of the game does really well is that it gives you the best of both worlds in terms of, again, the two halves of this experience. It feels like the best balancing of Grace and Leon, both in terms of how each of those sections are constructed, but also like in terms of the amount of time that you're spending with each one of those characters. And for me, that was what I thought was the strongest aspect of this, in that, you get to have these sections with Grace, and it's like you are going to run into some more familiar faces, right? You're going to run into the Lickers, and you're like, well, how the hell do I deal with these with her arsenal? And it's like, oh, well, now you've got Molotovs, and you've also got um, what is it? Things of acid,
Yeah.
basically. But at the same time, like, it doesn't fundamentally alter the experience for Grace, despite the fact you get these new tools. And if anything, like, you don't even have to use those, because what you could use is the broken bottles that she's had previously to lure the stalker enemy. And you can lure the Lickers into the various zombies that are still roaming around, right? And likewise, like, typically there's not a lot of crossover in terms of the strategies that you use between Grace and Leon. However, like, when you play as Leon and you go through the facility, and it's obviously much more action oriented focus, and his only way to get through them is to blow through these Lickers with his arsenal. You come across special forces teams that are essentially a byproduct of, I think they're either Umbrella or they're not. I'll circle back to that. But like, you can destroy the test subject chambers or tubes that you find of zombies and Lickers, and those can interact and fight the special forces instead of you, basically. So like, it's really cool that you get this sort of crossover for the very first time. But I think at the same time, like, each of those sections is clearly designed with the play styles of Grace and Leon in mind. And it makes for a section of the game that I don't think is perfect by any means, but at the same time, I think it's the best examples of how you can present combat situations with characters that typically at this point in the game you might feel invulnerable with, but if anything, you don't feel that at all, especially as Grace, even at that point.
Yeah, and obviously at that point, Leon's like illness is heavier, so
Yeah,
he's basically almost blacking out and having all these coughing fits and stuff. Again, very fucking Metal Gear Solid 4, like sort of the end of that game. Like, but oh my god, yeah. I was about to stop the game the night when I was down in the Ark, like, and in the grey section, and seeing the Licker come across the window for the first time. I was like,
yeah,
honestly, while I was a little eye rolly about the Mr. X thing, because I was kind of hoping the whole game that we get there like that. And I think it's just before that, there's like a little like research thing you can bring up on one of the screens that talks about all these different creatures like that. One of which is like a bit of a swerve, like in mentioning Nemesis, and like, yeah, well, technically yes, technically no, sort of thing. But seeing the Lickers mentioned there, I was like, oh, is it? Can it? Or is it just like old research? And it's like, oh man, yeah. When it did it, and it was like, as much as, again, like, it's nostalgia bait for it to happen, it was just like, when it's, yeah. And because of Grace's sections with that, they just recontextualized that. They made them frightening again. Like, they everything that Quiet Place game tried to do, like this, doing it better. Like it really was the whole, the glass on the floor, the trying to tiptoe around, the fact that you've got those like experimental cadavers walking around, like on some occasions as well, that they can see you but the Lickers can't, and again trying to find a way to strategize what to do in those moments and getting caught in a corner. Oh, it's like so intense. And again, it was so welcome to have a moment like that again so late after all that and all that goofiness and action that we'd had, to go back to being a tight horror game for a section, just for a bit. And again, not as long as any of the other grey sections necessarily, but still really adding something to it. And even with Leon, like, because he's not doing well by that point, and it's like they are still bloody lethal. They're terribly hard to beat, and yeah, they just feel as menacing as they did to me back in the 90s. It's like it was the most I felt back in Raccoon City, like in the whole game.
Yeah, I think, again, for me, like, it ends up being this thing that clearly I could view this as being nostalgia bait, but at the same time, like it feels like I'm getting an experience that sure it's steeped in nostalgia bait, but it's being presented in two ways that again are reflective of the Resi experience that's being presented. Right? It's like you get to have it in that notion of the old school and the new school, so to speak. And so for me, like, yeah, I can see it as like cool. There's liquors, cool, plant and whatnot. But I just find that again, like taking that nostalgia and then melding it into those two sides of an experience was one of those things that really actually ended up working for me in a facet that I did not expect it to the degree that it did, because, again, I was under the impression that this entire thing was just going to be along the lines of like the return to Raccoon City bit. Whereas here, um, I get to kind of go through those experiences with the more stealth oriented nature of things, which, dealing with the liquors as Grace is a lot more strategic and also like unnerving. The fact that you have to contend with this, that it's like, sure, I can hit them with a bottle of acid. And, I suppose when you get to the end of that portion, you probably have enough resources to handle that as you need to, which is great. But at the same time, like if you're playing on the harder difficulties, that can end up being the type of situation that is a lot more tense, because if you fuck up or miss or this or that, like your handgun's not going to do anything. So it's one of those things where it's like it felt more well balanced to me than I was anticipating it to be. So for those reasons, like I actually really appreciated the direction they took with that. And at the end of the day, perhaps I might have another feeling about it if it hadn't been built up the same way. But I don't know. I was just, again, like so impressed with the two distinct play styles. And I don't know, like I found that Grace's portion of the game was where the arc final really did shine, whereas Leon's was a little bit lesser. Which, when we get into maybe some of our larger grievances with the game, we can chat about. But
I mean, we're at the end point, and I think this is probably where I have most of my grievances with the game, just because I'm not sure about the structure. So part of it's my own fault. I think that the cutscene flashback thing before we get to the end, where Grace obviously realizes like that she's not technically important in all this. It's just it seemed like she was. Like this grand Elpis thing that will save or kill humanity or whatever, like the latest in a long line of things. And the idea is that you're given a choice of like destroy it or let it loose, sort of thing. And of course, it's, again, subversion. The idea like actually it's it's a cure, not a kill, sort of thing. And so that makes one of the endings redundant, really. But I chose that ending silly because I didn't really think through what I was doing. And God, I mean, if that had been the ending, we'd have heard a lot about it on the internet by now.
I picked that one as well initially, and thank Christ they give you the option to go back and pick the other one.
And it was so abrupt, everything after it. Yeah, just like, and honestly, to be fair, it's shocking because I mean, Leon's going to die at that point anyway, but like, it was just the way it happened, and it just being very definitive as well, which was like, bloody hell, because obviously a lot of the whole thing of Resident Evil is, someone's died slightly off camera, they're not dead, that sort of thing, whatever. So in a way, yes, I was wishing for something more akin to it. And the fact that it came up with there's another ending, you want to go back to that point and do it, like, cool. But the problem is, at that point, is, it's a cure, so of course, naturally, she's going to cure Leon, and like he can fight the big bad. Now, the handlings of the big bad. Xeno gets introduced quite late in, and obviously, he has connections to the past and the present, sort of thing. That was the most blue balls thing this whole game does, I think, was it's like, because you just keep thinking he's going to be a boss fight. It's going to be a boss fight, and in neither ending is he a boss fight. Like in one ending, he kills Leon and then falls to his death. and in the second ending, he gets beheaded by Victor Gideon. And that's like, it's just
Yeah.
like, it's like, and Leo ends up fighting Gideon, and Gideon's basically been infected with like a nemesis variant of the virus. So he's the one sort that evolves and keeps changing as they are dealt trauma. And so which Leon notes. And at first I was thinking, well, how the fuck do you know you weren't there? Sort of thing. Like,
Right.
but then I thought, you've been in Diasto long enough. You obviously had all the files on what did and didn't happen.
Mm.
And it's a typical end of Resident Evil boss fight. The rocket launcher comes out, of course, a part of it, and all that stuff. Which is fine. Absolutely fine with that. Absolutely fine with the outcomes of the idea of like, that even though it's a bit cloying, the whole idea of like Emily, the young girl in this game, not being dead, despite what they said earlier, and that Grace gets to sort of live a new life with her own adopted daughter, effectively, and everyone's happy and la la la, and the great evil has finally been killed off. But then they do a lot of stuff that says, we're waiting for DLC, we're waiting for the future, sort of thing. Like 2 teasers of Chris fucking Redfield, which to be honest, if he had shown up, I would have been like, "Fuck off! You've had your day." Like,
Yeah.
it's like you can't keep showing up at the end of Resident Evil games. It's not
Right.
fair for everyone else.
Give it a rest. Take a holiday.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Because when that team comes down, it's very clear the team from Village, Chris's team from Village. I was like, oh god, he's going to turn up, and it's like, oh yeah, but then they keep saying, oh, he's off doing something else, and it's like, oh. Right, so we're going to find out, I guess, whatever the DLC will be for this game down the line. But yeah, it's a bit swimmy as endings go. Very much trying to wrap things up, but not. And it's like, it feels like we're missing stuff still. Like there's still stuff to be discovered. Still stuff, and obviously the end credit scene is like an operative team down there still. Like, so something else is still going on. It's like, either way, it's like you've tried to make this feel like a fitting end, and it's not really quite felt like the end properly.
You don't say. This is not a complete conclusion to a Resi game. Like it's one of those things where I'm just like, yeah, I'm in the same boat as you. I'm just like, okay, so went through all of this, and yet at the very end, it feels like I have not gotten the complete picture, which at this point is probably one of my biggest gripes with Resident Evil games, the last few, because of the fact that, like audiences are going to show up for the next one. So like leaving these like shit kind of cliffhangers almost on them always feels especially unwarranted, because of the fact that even if they told a self-contained story that had the full wrap up, that was not something like this that ends in a manner where you feel like you're not getting the complete picture, like who's not going to show up for the next Resident Evil game where you could continue on this? You could have and also like the cliffhangers themselves are not original. Like you said, like how many times do we have to have a Chris Redfield kind of like, not a cameo exactly always, but have a Chris Redfield sort of like nod to him, and the fact that, oh yeah, he's working behind the scenes still. It's like, yeah, we fucking know that. Like how many of these games do we have to play where this is the nature of the endings of them?
Yeah, unless someone else. So someone else for once. Like,
yeah,
I mean,
exactly. Like
considering
make a new antagonist or a new character that shows up out of the blue, or just in general, like a new threat.
Even like considering this whole like Leon's end, if you will, sort of story, it's like something Claire based would be nice. Like, but yeah, I don't know. I'm guessing they've got a plan and a structure that ties into remaking the old games and coming back to the new games, and I'm sure Code Veronica is part of that plan, and
Sure,
how it all tie in. But hey, yeah, what can you do? It's like, I don't think a Resident Evil game has really satisfied me in its ending properly for a long time, but that's usually because the back halves are the same nonsense most of the time. At least this had some interesting late game bumps, and did some cool things. It's just unfortunately that, I think I saw someone point out, it's like you can kind of tell a point in this game where they pivoted the story and made it about something else, and it's like, it feels like that, yes, and they've done well to stitch it together in a lot of ways, but narratively, it does feel a bit iffy in that end. sort of trying to tie it all together, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, this basically leads into what I think is my biggest gripe with this game. And, I mentioned it earlier and I mentioned it plenty of times previously. Like, the narratives of Resident Evil games have not always worked for me. I've more or less accepted that, but I still really enjoy playing these games. It's just like whole super villain and kind of like anime feel of a lot of the narratives. Just it does not do as much for me. That being said, like the game starts super strong, I think, in terms of like its central antagonist, which initially is Victor Gideon, and yet, I don't know, like it feels like he disappears after a while to the degree that it's like that might be like the one biggest issue I have with the nostalgia portion of Leon's return to Raccoon City is that like, yeah, you've got that motorbike chase with Victor, but then like he disappears for until literally until the finale, I think. And like that is where Zeno steps up as being, essentially the central antagonist, his connections, crime syndicate. And, it's, I think more or less like we know that he is essentially Wesker, right? He's Wesker that is in someone else's body or something or Wesker's consciousness in somebody else's body, whatever they were doing with, the Elpis project and stuff. And it's just like they forego who I found to be the stronger of the two antagonists. And then, the final fight and what, is the true ending of the game where you fight Victor and he basically goes through the more or less like generic mutations of any boss at the end of a Resident Evil game where, he goes from essentially like the tyrant tentacle monster into like what is late stage Salazar from Resident 4 boss fight where, he's this big essentially tendril monster that you got to blow up all these boils on him. Otherwise he's going to, beat you to death or eat you to death kind of a thing. And like, that's where I think the game starts off and a majority of it is so strong in terms of everything, but it almost gets a little too lost in the weeds where when they have that switch to the action oriented nature of gameplay, the narrative also kind of like devolves into the narratives that typically went along with Resident Evil games that had that play style, if you will. And a lot of that could be like just subjective issues that I've had with a lot of the Resident Evil games, but I'm curious to hear like how you feel they handled overall, like the handling of the antagonists.
Well, the point is, like I said, you need to care when you don't end up facing them. And like Gideon, like you say, he is a background character, and I suppose it comes down to the story itself, which is the subversion of the idea of like there's a special one and they must be brought to the place to do the thing, and that plan effectively falls apart the second Grace reveals that no, actually it's not some great continuation of Spencer's work. It's Spencer's regret being made into effectively a cure of sorts. Which I will add, does that really work considering they've evolved what they were doing in the first place? So like since then, so would that cure still work? But again, these are nitpicky things. But at that point, it's like it feels like it only exists so that we can get Leon back to health and happy again and stuff like that. But yeah, and so what's the point of any sort of battle at that point? It's like Gideon's got no real beef with Leon. As I said, he's very disinterested with Leon in the most part. He gets annoyed, sure, by the end, but but yeah, it's like Xeno's just nothing, like set up to be nothing, and just like I said, and if they were counting that as a canon ending, he's decapitated. So but then again, as you say, if it's the continuation of the Wesker children's style thing, and which the orphanage kind of hints at, like a bunch of kids out there like that in the past, then yeah, sure, he could just be one of another, and things like that, and that would definitely feed into Chris having some sort of like his own Requiem, if you will, which involves a Wesker sort of thing. But I don't know. It's like no villain's really built up properly. Like the only villain was like a proper sort of through line is the girl. Like
Hmm.
in that sense, and it's a lovely tragic story, and the way it plays out and the way it ends, if it had been left as it was, would have been great and would have been a great bit of horror. But again, that's kind of soured by Leon's revelation of like, I didn't hit any major organs. Like yeah, but you also blew her head off, and she came back from that. To be fair, so it's like you blew her sister's head off, and that came back from that. So like it's yeah, I get it, but it's like it's daft in a way. But yeah, I don't. There's no villain that really has that through line, but Resi loves to like throw a bunch of villains into the piece and like say, oh, this is the bad guy, now this is the bad guy, now this is the bad guy, sort of thing. I mean, Resi 4 is a great example of that, really, when you think about it. Like, how many times do we get that where, like, no, this guy's the one you want to go after, and yeah, like, it's never just the one. It's the structure of those games. But here it's like you don't really have anyone that really feels like the end boss, just a deluded guy who's like every other fucking guy that's ever been.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. I understand that it's like more or less along the lines of like how Resi has treated a lot of its villains, but when you start out so strong
Mm.
in an aspect of villains that, I think are other than Lady Dimitrescu, like I don't know, like I thought that Victor Gideon was one of the stronger antagonists since the tone that was set with Resi 7. So the fact that, he's introduced, he seems to be such a central figure piece early on. And
He feels like he's supposed to be a stalker enemy at one point. Like in
yeah,
that
absolutely.
just before
Yeah.
the blister head thing,
Mhm.
where Grace is like hiding from him, it feels like there's supposed to be a section there, like with him,
Oh,
and
that would have been fantastic.
yeah. But I think maybe they were looking at what they had and said, we've had too much of this stuff already. Like maybe that's one too many. But then they go in the back. They do keep going back to that well of having stalker enemy, and it is a bit almost could be an overabundance had they not spaced it out the way they had. So that's the thing. I think that's where the pivot must have been on how they used Gideon, and I think that's where it's most apparent they pivoted the story at some point, and he was supposed to be bigger in that story than he is.
This is the thing, like that would have been, and like I realized maybe it would have been at odds with the direction that they were taking Leon's portions early on when you're cutting between Grace and him, but like that would have been perfect. Instead of having that underwhelming chunk battle, imagine having to navigate those halls while contending with uh, Gideon, just like attacking you periodically. Like that would
Yeah.
have been, oh my God, that would have been one of the coolest portions of the game, I bet. But,
Hmm.
like you said, it is what it is. I'm not going to keep wishing for something that didn't happen, but I just overall, like, it seems like a waste of what otherwise I thought was the more intriguing of any of the enemies or boss figures in this game. Because again, it's just like it feels so grounded in a way that so many of the other enemies and antagonists are not. That
Hmm.
it just feels like a missed opportunity, I suppose. But now I'm doing what I hate when people do, which is wish for something that was never promised. But
Yeah.
anyways, it just further speaks to like, yeah, that was an incredibly strong character that kind of petered out and fizzled out at the end, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's like the Krauser thing, isn't it? It's like well, there's a
Yeah,
character that really
exactly.
is not like major in that story, but he's important enough to
Mm.
Leon that it makes those repeat encounters something personal and gives them something. And that's good. But as I said, nobody really has that here. Nobody really has, and it does just feel like I said, there's structure in this game that's been broken down by something that's changed in development. And given there were all sorts of rumors about what the game would have been and wasn't like that, infamously, it wouldn't be the first time that's happened to Leon's, Resident Evil game. It happened before, so yeah, it makes sense that he's been devalued slightly, maybe from a change in what they're doing and maybe plans of other stuff. I guess we'll see in time, and I won't be surprised when we see some sort of like a expansion of some sort, or like extra story thing that's something a bit more significant than maybe we've seen with the previous games. like because like I said, they've hinted far too much,
Mm.
like there being something. So whether it be a Chris Wesker thing or whatever, we'll definitely see. Because otherwise, in time, the treatment of the antagonists in this game does feel a bit, yeah.
Well, it's the thing, right? Is that we both more or less assume like we think this feels incomplete, but chances are there's going to be some sort of DLC. I wouldn't be surprised if they really go the distance with this one and give you some kind of DLC that is akin to what was it? What was the Ada Wong
Yeah,
DLC for
Separate Ways
Resi
one,
2?
yeah.
Yeah, like that
On
one.
four,
So
yeah. Oh, on four, yeah, yeah.
yeah, oh, sorry. So it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, these feelings of something not being fully well-rounded in terms of an ending are probably going to be a fleeting feeling, but at the same time, like it's still a little disheartening that like we have to rely on DLC to give us a conclusion for something that by and large we enjoyed. It's just that, it doesn't feel like maybe it was as all-encompassing as it should have been.
Yeah,
So
and it goes back, just to sort of finish on this. It's like
Mhm.
what we said earlier, about the game maybe not explaining itself well enough at times early on. It's like that end part really does just feel like it's overdoing it, like in telling us, where's Chris? Someone's got to mention Chris at all times, sort of thing, and like
Yeah.
give us all the hints to Chris, 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 and it's like, why mention him if you're not going to use him? Blah blah
Yeah.
blah blah blah, sort of thing. And yeah, it's like it's the exact opposite approach. And again, another sort of symptom of maybe this not being the game that it was initially envisioned to be, which isn't surprising. As I said, many games go through that clearly, and change through development, but feels like a late pivot in so many ways.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I don't know. I think this is the thing. Like, I enjoyed this so much that at the same time, like my issues with it feel a bit stronger. And granted, I mean, I'll be the one that comes out and says it first, right? Just to be that guy. But like, I absolutely loved this game. I told you as much when we chatted before we were recording. I was like, there was one night where I got to, I think it was the Raccoon City portion. I was on the outskirts, and as soon as I got to that bit, I knew it was coming. But as soon as I got to that bit, I was like, "Oh shit! Okay, I'm gonna have to keep playing this." And it was like I told myself 10 more minutes, and then it ended up being an hour to the degree that, and this never happens usually, but my girlfriend literally came in from the next room and was just like, "So are you like coming to bed? Like, what is going on?" And I was just like I haven't had a moment like that in a good long while. And it was one of those things where it's like, yeah, I really struggled to kind of just put this down. And it wasn't just the nostalgia factor, but again, like I keep coming back to just to the overall pacing of this game. And I found it to be the type of thing where it was paced to the degree that like I didn't feel like I was burnt out on it the same way that I do with any game that I'm like way too into the weeds with. And that's not a commentary on the game itself, but just me in general, right? It's like if I'm going to be
Yeah.
sitting down and playing a game for hours, like I'm not playing most games for more than 2 hours at a time anymore. So the fact that I was sitting there and playing this for like 3 hours and wanted to keep going, it was one of those things where I was like, oh, okay, this is indicative of pacing that understands like giving players a reprieve, but not forcing them out of the actual experience itself. It's like giving them that variety that so many games are seldomly missing.
Yeah, ironically, it feels like the lesson it's learned most is not even from one of the newer games. It's from the original Resident Evil 4 in terms of breaking the game up into chunks and like having those chunks have enough different things in them and feel like, but then also expanding it where they need to. It's like, so taking that framework of the original Resident Evil 4 and just like, so we're going to have a bit of this, then a bit of this, then a bit of this, then a bit of this, and like chopping and changing, like you said, never really letting you settle too long into anything and just getting you with those longer sections, giving you just enough to feel like you're spending good time on it and really soaking it in like that. That's for the majority of the game, that's exactly what it does. And that's a fantastic achievement in itself to blend those two things together so well.
No, I mean, absolutely. And like we've been saying, it's going to be very interesting to see what is released and what's planned to kind of like be the dovetail for this experience. I'm really quite interested to see that because of the fact that like whatever they're going to release as a follow-up, not thinking, all the way down the line in terms of like the next main series entry or anything like that, but just in terms of like what supplemental DLC that they release with this, is it going to be able to encapsulate what I think Requiem has done so incredibly well, in that it's providing, again, that variety and that multitude of experiences that complement one another, and overall provide an experience that's unlike anything offered in other Resident Evil games, in terms of, again, being this amalgamation of what has worked in the past, and sort of like being this self-reflective kind of look at where Resi's come from. So I think that ultimately for me is going to be what is really the most telling, because, obviously if I get a whole nother chapter and it's just plays like Leon or just plays like Grace, that's fine. I'm going to play the shit out of it anyways, but I'm just very interested to see how they're able to like complement this narrative in a way that's meaningful, and if the gameplay will be as reflective in sort of their thinking about, what would be as representative in a meaningful way as what, they released last. So I think that will be very telling to see.
Very much.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's gonna do it for our probably the longest chat we've had in a good long while, but it was very fitting in terms of, getting to chat about the latest main entry in the Resident Evil franchise, and a game that we've been speculating about and waiting very eagerly for a good long while. So yeah, I think that's going to do it. And be sure to not only check out last week's edition of Horror Bites, but go dig around in our back catalog, because we've got plenty of chats about the Resident Evil franchise. Man, we've covered, seemingly almost every installment outside of maybe one or two main entries. But for people that want more Resi chats, we definitely have a lot more content along those lines. But until then, my friend, as always, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you, my man. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's main feed episode of Safe Room. If you've enjoyed our horrifying discussions, please take a moment to rate and review the show on your preferred podcast platform, as this helps us immensely in ensuring that the show continues to grow. For any and all show updates and additional content, you can follow Safe Room on all of our socials, which are linked in the episode notes, at Safe Room Pod. And finally, you can send any and all emails to saferoompod@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.
Watch The Toxic Avenger now on Screambox. The radioactive superhero that's certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes is available to watch now from the comfort of your home. Bloody FM listeners get a special introductory offer by going to bit.ly/ToxyFM. That's bit.ly/ToxieFM for a special offer on Screambox.
Sometimes you gotta do something.